So now we're going to talk about a little bit further about the board of directors, a little more detail than what I included before. So, as I mentioned, the primary responsibility of board of directors is to represent the interests of the owners or the shareholders. Now, directors in large corporations are chosen after being nominated by the currently existing board of directors, and they have to be approved by a majority vote of shareholders. Now, most shareholders don't actively vote. A lot of shareholders also delegate their voting authority to members of the board. Directors who are employees of a firm are called inside directors, and those who are not employed are called outside directors. Okay? So sometimes there are members of the board, like for example the CEOs can be chairman of the board. Sometimes the CFO or the COO are also on the board. We'll talk about the outside directors in just a couple minutes because they're kind of special. Boards are divided into different committees. Sometimes there's oversight committees, there's investigative committees, there's strategy committees, all sorts of kind of committees, just like you'd find in any large organizations. Now the law says that, as I mentioned, the board of directors has to represent the interests of stockholders or owners, and they have to do some degree of diligence in supervising management, normally the CEO. Now when I said they exercise their diligence in supervising management, they don't make day-to-day decisions, so they're not really managing the little details. They don't typically visit the floor, the shop of a company, and really intervene or interfere in any sort of a meaningful way. Instead, they exercise extremely broad oversight. Their compensation varies among industries, and what they try to do to maximize their compensation is they peg it. So for example, if you were a small food company, you might try to increase your compensation as a board member by comparing your very small company to some of the larger food companies and say, well, in those larger food companies, their directors are paid this amount, and that's how much money we'd like to have. Of course, the argument would be, you're working for a small company, why do you deserve all that compensation? And they can say, well, because we aspire to be big like them, so we need the big pay too. There's always ways around it. Or we're a small food company, but the big oil companies pay their directors this much, so our compensation should increase because we have X, Y, and Z similarities with those large firms in another industry. I think it's a little weird the way they come up with their compensation figures, but that's kind of the reason that you'll find. A couple other things that the board will do: they issue any sort of securities like bonds, and of course they also exercise on the voting rights of stakeholders, so you can delegate your voting rights to different board members. They're the ones that compose the company strategy. They also select the CEO. They're the ones that evaluate the CEO's performance, and they remove that person if necessary. So they are essentially the CEO's boss. However, sometimes the CEO is also the chairman of the board of directors, so there's kind of a weird tension because they're the boss of the people. As a chairman of the board of directors, they're the boss of all the directors, but in their role as a CEO, they are answerable to the directors. So it's kind of weird. You basically have a CEO whose boss is the directors, and then their boss's boss is also themselves. It's kind of a weird thing. Another thing that the directors do is they can give advice and general guidance to senior level managers. Of course, they create the governance policies of the firm, which I mentioned already, including its compensation, particularly the compensation of the CEO. They evaluate each other, which is problematic too, because you're being evaluated by your peers, and typically these people are also your friends. They also can evaluate the different board committees and the performance of the board as a whole. They can nominate new candidates for directors, and in theory they exercise oversight of ethics and compliance programs. On average, a board would have about 11 members, although this number can vary some, and it's been that way for a long time. Typically, most state and corporation laws say that the number of board members should be a minimum of 3, but the range is usually between 7 and 15. As I mentioned, directors are elected by shareholders, and these are terms of 1 year. Now, I mentioned inside directors because those are employees of the company. There's also outside directors and independent directors. An outside director is someone who, maybe a CEO or a senior executive manager, or maybe a firm that is a competitor, or maybe not a competitor, but maybe a stakeholder. Sometimes they are also come from competing firms, but that's a whole other story. Usually, but they're stakeholders, people who have great knowledge in management. Michael Porter, one of the, well, let me get to him in just a second. So outside directors are usually senior management or CEOs of firms that are usually within the stakeholder map of those of a given firm. There's also independent directors, and those are members who are individuals who are directors, but where they come from is usually an organization that has no real meaningful ties to that given firm. So Michael Porter, a great professor at Harvard Business School, can sit on boards of a variety of firms, but he's a professor at Harvard Business School. He doesn't really do business with any of these firms, and so he's on the board of directors. Sometimes you'll also find independent directors who are retired senior executive service. So, former directors of the post office, directors of the FBI, former generals and admirals, those kinds of individuals, and they'll sit on those boards as well. Again, because they're retired former flag officers or senior executive service, they don't have any real everyday business with those firms, but they're generally seen as strategists. There's also some celebrities that sit on firms as independent directors. I guess it provides a little star power to the firm. Now, a lot of boards meet around 8 times a year, but they can also meet monthly. On the agenda, they usually show up, they get a big binder, it's full of all sorts of stuff. There'll be committee reports, governance matters, presentations by company executives, etc. They probably don't spend a lot of time reviewing these materials until they get to where they're going to meet. A lot of them fly in from other places. They have other jobs and other things on their plates. So this is usually kind of a part-time duty for them. They show up, they go through the binders, and then they have their meetings. The chairman of the board presides over these meetings. And typically, people on the board of directors, they all know each other. There's usually some sort of a collegial attitude on the board of directors. They're all CEOs of the same firms. They've probably all gone to similar schools. So there's kind of a collegial attitude. Now, I mentioned a lot of people think that it's bad to have the CEO, and we'll talk about this. Those of you that are taking my class in person, we'll talk about this in a little bit more depth, and I may wind up doing a video later on this very subject. But a lot of people think that it's a bad idea to have the CEO also be the chairman of the board, and there's kind of a pro and con of each side. By having the chairman be a different person than the CEO, it means that there's kind of an extra check. It's kind of like the checks and balances or countervailing forces model. It's kind of an extra check on the CEO. Frequently, when the CEO is also the chairman of the board, they can dominate the board of directors, and they can dominate the firm, and sometimes this may not be fully in the interest of the shareholders. Now, most managers oppose, especially senior level managers, oppose this separation because it's very confusing when the CEO gives one set of guidance and the board of directors gives a very separate set of guidance, and this can result in inertia. One of the worst kind of decisions that you can make is no decision, and having the leadership separated can lead to a degree of confusion. So what we're going to talk about in our next video is going to be executive compensation and how that's determined. I think it's pretty interesting, all the ways that CEOs are paid in addition to their salary. So I'm looking forward to seeing you then.